Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for October 7th. And what I wanted to do was to continue discussing drama as well as also talking a little bit about our first paper. So the last class I was talking a little bit about the elements of writing a paper, and in your syllabus and other document section you've got a handout on writing the critical paper, which is what we are going to be doing. That talks about the importance of analyzing, not summarizing, or what I call the junior high school book report, not talking about what happened, but why those things happened. So basically assume that the reader has some familiarity with the text. Basically, you are just reviewing those elements of the text that the reader, that you need in order to be able to convince the reader of your particular argument, which is your thesis. That implies some sort of interpretive conclusion about the work, and usually it is in the first paragraph. You want to make sure that the argument is comprehensive enough to be important, but not too general. For instance, and this is in the handout about the critical paper, saying something like, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience is much too broad, because that would be applicable to every author and every text that we're reading this semester. Or saying something like Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet, same sort of idea. You're not really saying much of anything. What you want to do is say what kind of imagery is employed and how and why that imagery is important. And we talked a little bit about paragraph construction, that you've got several sentences in a paragraph, minimum 3. The first sentence, usually the topic sentence, which serves as a kind of summary of what that paragraph is about. So if it's well written, you can basically read the opening sentences of each of the paragraphs and get a kind of outline. And your job is to support your particular position, both with paraphrase, when you're using your own language to basically describe something that happened within the text, or quotation, and that's exact language word for word. Again, you don't want to use too much quotation to pad the paper. The idea is that the paper length comes from argument, not from quotation or from language that is unnecessary. So I'd rather have a shorter paper that's more concise, and as opposed to a longer paper that could be something that could be reduced in terms of its language, but probably has length more because of unnecessary words than in terms of its argumentation. And generally, you don't want to end a paper with a quotation, or end a paragraph, I should say, with a quotation, because basically what you want to do is to comment on the relevance of the quote. And then you need to save something for your conclusion, which also needs to be developed like any other paragraph. You don't want to just reiterate exactly what you said in the intro. And you want to make sure that in one way or another, you're giving the reader a sense of closure. Perhaps you could relate at another work by the same author. Perhaps you could connect the text to present day. Or some other general observation that would serve as a way to conclude your paper. And then the critical paper handout talks about writing, that the first principle of good writing is economy and the second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. So to try to start writing early in drafts so that you can go through your sentences and ask yourself, can I say this in fewer words without sacrificing meaning? And if you can, generally speaking, you should. And while adjectives and adverbs or descriptive words can be very useful in your writing, to use them because they're necessary, not because, again, you're trying to add length to the paper. And varying your sentences. So they should be of different lengths, some short and some long. Too many long sentences sound dense. Too many short sentences sound choppy. And varying your sentence beginnings, that you don't want multiple sentences in a row starting all in the same way. And you want to try to avoid cliches, overused expressions, and also to avoid not just cliches, but trite expressions and any kind of slang. Slang is considered informal language, language that would not be considered academic or standard. Cliches, overused expressions like dead as a doornail, for instance, or raining cats and dogs, just because there's a greater possibility of misunderstanding those particular expressions. So rather than saying a cool dude, which is slang, You would say an interesting person, because it's much more likely to be universally understood. And then you want to save some time for proofreading, which is where most students run out of time because they start writing too late. So basically, if you have difficulty with proofreading, you might want to read backwards, start with the last sentence of your paper and work your way forward so you can concentrate on the sentences. You do want to have a title for your paper, and it should be something that's original. It shouldn't be, for instance, called A Soldier's Home, because that title's already been taken by Ernest Hemingway if you're writing about a soldier's home. Though you can embed the title within your own writing, and you could say something like Conflict in a Soldier's Home. Now, any text that's been published and that is shorter, such as a short story like Soldier's Home, is put into quotation marks. Any longer text that's been published, let's say a drama or a novel, is either underlined or it is put in italics. You do not need to put your own titles, however, either in quotation marks or italics, because ultimately you haven't been published yet. And in that opening paragraph, you should also identify the work that you are discussing and the author. And that makes it very clear to the reader where you're headed. And if you're reading along with the handout, this gives you an idea of how old this handout is, where it says instructors prefer typewritten papers. Your paper needs to be typed double-spaced, 1-inch margins, with a title page that lists your name, my name, the due date. And all of this is in our class syllabus as well, and I'm hopeful is review from what you would have talked about in English 101. So basically, that's a general overview. And I wanted to talk also a little bit about quotation and documentation. And that you can see that in the notes below, I've got some examples of how you would quote or document using the MLA system, the Modern Language Association system of parenthetical documentation. This is where we use parentheses immediately after a quote. And in the parentheses, we indicate information where the reader can find the original quote. The idea is to keep things as simple and concise as possible in the parentheses, because there is a works cited page at the ending of the paper that lists all of the texts you would have used by author's last name, and then author's first name, and then you've got title, place of publication, publisher, so forth, so that you could get the same edition and verify the authenticity of that quote. And this is very important, particularly if you are writing research papers, because you're using lots of outside sources. But remember, I had indicated that we're writing a critical paper. In other words, you do not need to use outside resources. What that means is that you don't necessarily have to submit a works cited page, because I know what you would be putting in your works cited page. You would be listing our textbook, for instance, for class. So that said, if you do not want to submit in a works cited page, you do not have to. But if you do add a works cited page, then you want to make sure that you're documenting that correctly. And you can find that in the GCC library. You'll notice that in the notes below, I have a link that talks a little bit about citation that the library has posted. There are lots of different styles and systems for citing and quoting, depending on the discipline. But again, we're using MLA. There also is a wonderful site called Purdue OWL that you might have heard of before. And again, the link is below. And it's by Purdue University. And it also reviews the entire writing process. So if you needed to look up something about writing, you certainly could do it in that way. Or certainly ask me. So you can see that in that documentation section, that's the 5th section, I've indicated that you use quotation marks to show the reader that you're using an exact quote, word for word. And then you close your quote marks, and regardless of whether or not you're done with your sentence, immediately after you use parentheses, and in those parentheses, at the very least, you indicate the page number. And then if it's not clear what page number you're referencing from which text, then you would add the author's last name. And then if you've got multiple texts from the same author, then you would add part of the title as well as the author's last name and the page number. So you get the idea. So here, it's very clear that the quote I'm using, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, that in the parentheses, the 162 is in reference to page 162 in our textbook. Notice that P or PG or PAGE is not referenced in those parentheses, just the actual number. And then you would close your documentation, and then you would either end your sentence with your ending punctuation or continue on your sentence and then eventually end it. Now, one of the things that you can see is in the second example that this quotation doesn't end the sentence, so I wanted you to see how that would look. Quote, although Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote, open parentheses, 162, close parentheses, he cannot pray with his mother, period. So in this instance, we just continued on the sentence and then ended. Now, if you are adding in your own language, there is a way to go about doing that inside of a quotation. Usually you do that in order to clarify something, not to analyze it, because you can analyze it elsewhere. But for instance, let's say you're using a pronoun, a word like he or she or it, that based on the quote that you've selected, it's unclear what that pronoun is referencing or who that pronoun is referencing. So immediately after the pronoun, you could add your own language. And the way you would do that is by utilizing square brackets within the quote. And you can see the example below with insertion. Even his, and then in square brackets, I have Krebs's. And basically that means Krebs's is my language. Krebs's, and then I close my square brackets. Lies were not sensational. So that lets you know that this is not the exact quote. Anything in the square brackets was my insertion to help clarify. And then, of course, I've got my parentheses, and then I've got my closing punctuation. You can also omit something in a quote, assuming that it's not relevant. You don't want to omit something that would change the meaning of the quote, but if you are omitting something just because it's not necessary, you would use what we call an ellipsis, or 3 periods, or 3 dots. And you can see that under omission. Krebs, and then I've got, quote, during this time, ... or period, was sleeping late in bed, and then unquote. So basically what those 3 dots indicate is that I've left out a word or several words that just aren't necessary for the meaning of that particular quotation. Again, you can look this up in Purdue OWL in the GCC library as well, or you can ask me. I'm hopeful again that writing a paper is all review at this point, since you would have talked about it in English 101, though the writing you would have done would have probably been about your own personal experiences or some of the issues that the world is facing at large. You probably wouldn't have been directing it specifically to literature, which is what this particular class is about. So what I wanted to do was to also introduce the idea, or continue to introduce the idea of drama. As you know, last class we talked about the idea that drama is meant to be performed. So we've got multiple classes devoted to drama, and in part so that we could watch performance as well as have time to read the plays. And we're beginning with Sophocles and his very famous play, Oedipus the King, that helped to establish the tragic tradition, the tradition that is utilized by dramatists such as Shakespeare. When you think of some of the great Shakespearean plays, Hamlet, Macbeth, and Othello, they are tragedies. And Shakespeare would have followed the criteria established by individuals such as Sophocles, but also would have made changes for his own creative purposes. So Sophocles lived in the 400s BC Athens, Greece. He was a statesman, he was a general, and also a dramatist. So he was skilled in multiple areas. And there are over 120 play fragments that exist. There are only a handful that are intact. And some that are intact include the Oedipus trilogy, because the story of Oedipus is about 3 plays. We're reading only one, the first out of the 3, called Oedipus the King. The second play is entitled Antigone, which is the story of Oedipus's adult daughter. And I believe you have that in your textbook. And the third is Oedipus at Colonus, which is the story of Oedipus as an old man. So his story continues after Oedipus the King, but we are reading Oedipus the King in class. And some of the ways that Sophocles established himself as a playwright was by adding a third actor on stage, so there would be additional complexity to the play. And the role of the chorus was reduced. And basically, the chorus would be a group of individuals who would be representational of, let's say, community members. They could also serve as narrators in some respects, because it's not necessarily easy to have a narrator in a drama if it's all dialogue based. Not certainly in the way that we could have a narrator in a short story. So the chorus would oftentimes basically serve that dual function, and they would also be very practical in the sense that knowing something about Greek amphitheaters would be incredibly important in terms of understanding some of the limitations and some of the conventions associated with performing drama. They didn't have the kind of modern technologies that we have today, so there were challenges in terms of being able to see and hear the plays. The plays were funded by the state. They were viewed as religious vehicles, as well as a place to reinforce things like community values. And Greek amphitheaters were basically rising seats that were built into the hillsides that could seat as many as 14,000 people. And you can imagine being at the very top end of those seats and the difficulties you would have with seeing and hearing a performance. This is where the chorus can come in, because if everyone in the chorus is reciting their lines at the same time, in effect they would be a kind of chanting, singing, then basically that would increase the volume. The Greek amphitheaters are also marvels of acoustics as well, so sound travels very well. The actors would be wearing face masks so that it would be easier to differentiate the different people, because again, if you're in the so-called nosebleed section, it's going to be difficult for you to be able to differentiate faces. So they would wear these large masks. And these masks probably had amplification devices in them as well that would help with volume. The wardrobe would also consist of these large padded costumes and platform shoes, again, to make the actors a little bit more visible. And the performance that I'm hopeful that we'll be able to watch, I know that it used to be available online, but copyright is an issue, so I need to investigate, see if it's still available for free online for us to stream, is a performance that tries to mimic what we would have seen during a 430 BC amphitheater presentation. So it's going to seem very far removed from modern day. And in part, we're watching this performance for more its historical value than we are for the actual understanding of the play. Because one of the things that was common during this time period was that the audience would know the plot of the play prior to the play. In part, because again, some of the challenges that an audience would have with seeing and hearing the action that was going on. So I want to make sure that we also know part of the plot of the play before we actually watch Oedipus the King, and the textbook talks about it as well. So when you're watching a performance, you already know the plot, so then you can appreciate basically the acting and the actual presentation. And some of the conventions of the time included something called Deus Ex Machina, which meant God from the machine. And this was a mechanical stage device so that you could lower characters onto stage, or perhaps you could raise characters up into the heavens. It's a name that we still use today in drama performances, and basically it's a way to illustrate when an artificial device is used to give a quick resolution to a dramatic performance. For instance, at the ending of the dramatic performance, a character wakes up and it turns out everything that we've seen is just a dream, so none of it is real. So that's what Deus Ex Machina would be. And the audience, in terms of what they were supposed to experience, they should see or feel a sense of catharsis. In other words, pity and fear, that they could pity the main character because the main character is experiencing such tragic events. And the main character is a good person, someone that we admire. In fact, the main character is supposed to be someone who's above and beyond us, somebody who seems to be more incapable of error than we are. And that would be Oedipus in this particular instance. So we feel pity, and because it wasn't all their fault, but they did have some elements that helped to bring about their downfall. And that's where we feel fear, because if they could bring about a downfall upon themselves, and they're such superior beings, we could bring an equal kind of downfall, or even worse, upon ourselves. So this is called catharsis, the idea that an audience would feel pity and an audience would feel fear, so they can go through these emotions while watching a play. And oftentimes Greek dramas were about hubris, and the moral or the lesson was about the importance of avoiding hubris. Hubris means excessive pride, and definitely we see that in Oedipus the King. And I had also assigned for us to read on tragic character, and this was written by Aristotle, who you probably are familiar with as a philosopher, but he also dabbled in literary criticism. And of course, the selection I'm asking you to read on page 1165 is a translation, much like the Oedipus the King that we're reading is a translation, because we aren't reading it in the original Greek. But basically, what Aristotle says in this selection is that a dramatic tragedy should have several elements associated with it. It should be complex. If for no other reason, literature should be complex. We've talked about that as a class. It should be about terrible and piteous events, because it's a tragedy. If it was about happy events, then it wouldn't be a tragedy. And Aristotle identifies specifically Oedipus the King as perhaps the finest example of tragedy. So that's how highly regarded it was. And that a tragedy would have someone known as a tragic hero. This would be the central character of the play, who would be a great individual, above and beyond the ordinary. Again, somebody that we could respect and admire, who experiences a downfall. And the downfall happens because of some sort of character flaw or flaws. So there are elements that they're responsible for. Oftentimes, one of the flaws happens to be hubris. Again, that excessive pride. But there are also outside forces, things that you can't control. This is why we feel a certain level of pity. Whether you want to call those outside forces fate, or you want to call those outside forces destiny, or you want to call those outside forces luck, but things that you cannot control. And then a good tragic hero ultimately accepts responsibility for their part in their fall. And there's a learning that goes on both for the tragic hero and for us as readers. As we experience, again, pity, because ultimately this was a good person and it wasn't all of their fault. And fear, because if this good person is capable of flaws, then we are certainly capable of flaws as well. And characters should be basically presented as realistically as possible. So their action should be necessary and probable based on the context of the play itself. And some of you who are familiar with psychology might be familiar with Sigmund Freud and the Oedipal complex, which Sigmund Freud, known as the father of psychology, basically used very loosely many terms from literature to name his psychological theories. And he used the play Oedipus the King very loosely to name his theory of the Oedipal complex. And basically the Oedipal complex, Freud's theory, argues that young boys have some sort of physical attraction to their mothers. And there's another theory called the Electra complex, that young girls have some sort of physical attraction to their fathers, and that they see the opposite sex parent as competition. And this is very loosely based on Oedipus the King. This gets us to the plot of Oedipus, which again the audience would have known beforehand. And Oedipus the King begins in media res, in the middle. And basically what we find out is that there is a king named Oedipus who is trying to determine the cause of a terrible plague that's ravaging his community. So basically he has had some of his advisors consult the gods. Remember, this is a society of gods in the plural, to see what sin they all could have committed to be punished with this horrible plague. And the results keep coming back the same, that basically Oedipus himself is the reason for the plague. And he's horrified and in disbelief. He accuses individuals of lying or trying to steal his kingdom or having some sort of conspiracy against him, but he can't and won't believe it. And then as the play progresses, we get additional pieces of information. And guess what? We find out that Oedipus indeed was responsible for the plague. This is all backstory that we're told during the play. So how could all of this have happened? Well, it begins prior to Oedipus's birth, as we find out, where Oedipus's parents are told, once Oedipus is born, that their child will ultimately commit a terrible sin when this child becomes an adult. This child will kill his father and marry his mother. And of course the parents are horrified, and they decide they need to stop this terrible thing from happening. So they give the child to one of their servants with the instructions to kill the baby. And the servant feels pity on the baby and instead abandons the baby on a mountaintop. And it turns out the baby is found by another servant from another kingdom and brings the baby to the other kingdom. And the rulers of that kingdom decide to raise that baby as their own biological child. And that ends up being Oedipus. And now as a man, he consults the oracles, which was common at the time to consult oracles to find out about your future, your fate. And he's given a terrible prophecy. And he's told that he will soon kill his father and marry his mother. And of course, he wants to try to avoid that fate as much as possible. So what he decides he needs to do is to take action by abandoning his family and going off into another land. And as he's traveling, it just so turns out he's at a crossroads. This is important. And it's both literal and figurative. And there's a chariot blocking his way. And in a fit of anger, because his way is being blocked, he ends up slaying everyone in the chariot. And it just so turns out that we find out later that one of the people he killed was his biological father. Because Oedipus never knew that he was adopted. So when he leaves home, he thinks he's leaving his biological parents, but he's not. And then Oedipus comes across a community that's ravaged by plague. And it just so turns out that this community has recently lost their king as well. And they are threatened by this terrible monstrosity known as the Sphinx. And the only way to defeat the Sphinx is to answer its riddle. There's an old literary tradition here where monstrosities would basically have riddles that needed to be solved. And the riddle is, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, 3 legs in the evening? The answer, by the way, which no one was able to get except for Oedipus, is man. That what walks on 4 legs in the morning, that's a baby crawling. What walks on 2 legs in the afternoon, that's an adult walking. What walks on 3 legs in the evening, and that's an elderly person with a cane. And basically, no one was smart enough to be able to solve this riddle, but Oedipus was. So he was able to save the community from the Sphinx. And his reward, because the king had recently been killed, was to be given the kingdom and also the widowed queen, whom he marries and he has children with. Her name is Jocasta. And it just so turns out that the woman he marries, as he finds out, eventually is also his biological mother. So he commits incest with her, and her children are the products of incest. And this is the reason why when we are beginning Oedipus the king, the gods are so angry with Oedipus, because ultimately he has engaged in the sin of incest. And of course, part of it is his fault for his arrogance and thinking that he could outwit the gods, and his quick temper, such as slaying somebody on the road. I once had a student say that that was perhaps the earliest literary example of road rage they ever read, and I certainly can't disagree. But it's also not his fault completely, because if he is fated, then that gets to questions of what is fate and what is free will and what is destiny. And if something is fated, does that mean we can't change the outcome? It's something that philosophy and also religion grapples with. So we see how Oedipus can fit into that criteria of the tragic hero. And we also see how someone like Sigmund Freud could very loosely base his theories about children being attracted to the opposite sex parent on the Oedipus the King story, because Oedipus ultimately kills his father, albeit not deliberately, and ends up marrying his mother, albeit not deliberately. So that's where we get the Oedipal complex from. The end result of this, as we continue to read the play, is that Oedipus's wife / mother is so horrified, she figures it out before Oedipus does. In fact, everybody figures it out before Oedipus does. Rather ironic, because he's supposed to be a great riddle solver. She's so horrified by it all. First, she encourages him to stop digging and to get at the truth, which, again, illustrates that she cares more about herself than she does about her community when she's suffering from plague. And then, ultimately, when the truth is revealed, she runs off and commits suicide. She uses the pins from her brooches and basically, or actually she hangs herself. And then Oedipus comes across her body and sees the pins of her brooches and takes them, and he gouges out his eyes, because his eyes have betrayed him, because even though he had physical vision, he had no insight. And one of the people that he consulted happened to be a prophet who was physically blind. His name was Tiresias, but had insight. And Tiresias told Oedipus, "You're responsible." And Oedipus again just reacted, filled with passion and anger, and refused to accept it. So now that Oedipus has blinded himself, he's much like that blind prophet. He cannot see, but yet he has insight. And then he exiles himself, basically, and the person that he accused of trying to usurp his position and basically commit treason, his brother-in-law, Creon, ironically becomes the person who will now rule the kingdom, even though Creon didn't necessarily want to rule the kingdom, and told Oedipus earlier on, "No, I'm not trying to steal this kingdom from you, because I would never want your job. I'm quite happy with the perks I have as being part of the royal family, but with none of the responsibilities that a king has." And then Oedipus goes off, again ironically because he's blind, on 3 legs. His own 2 legs, and also he has a walking stick because he is blind. And that's how Oedipus the King ends. And then the next play, if we were to read it, is about Antigone, and that is Oedipus's daughter, now as an adult. And it also continues the story of Creon, who is now a much older ruler. And in some ways it's quite ironic, because in Oedipus the King, Creon is a pretty nice guy and very temperate and reasonable, rational. He's the exact opposite in the next play, Antigone. In fact, he seems much like Oedipus, filled with anger and passion, and perhaps there's a commentary there about how the position of rule can lead to changes within one's temperament. And then the third play, Oedipus at Colonus, is Oedipus as an old man, blind, with his walking stick, and seeing if whether or not the gods will forgive him now that he has punished himself. Remember, a tragic hero should punish themselves, which is what Oedipus does. He gouges out his eyes and he exiles himself. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what the play Oedipus the King is. And in terms of this drama and all dramas, I had you read a section about the elements of drama so that you can get a sense of the way that dramas are structured. Usually they're divided into acts. These are the main divisions of a play. And oftentimes they're divided into scenes where you've got divisions in the acts for new locations or the introduction of new characters. Keep in mind that Oedipus the King is really the very early days of play acting. So we're not necessarily going to see all of the elements that we associate with drama in Oedipus. By the time we get to Shakespeare, we certainly shall. Dramas oftentimes have subplots, in other words, multiple plots going on at the same time that all relate to one another. We'll definitely see that in Shakespeare. Stage directions, as I believe I talked about last class, are extremely important because these are the playwright's instructions to the actors on how to perform or what the set should look like for the director. So it's very important for us to try to visualize those. And you can expect a kind of pyramid action in dramas, but I think that's true of most pieces of literature, where you have a rise of action, much like when you begin at the bottom of the pyramid and then you get to the top, and then you get a fall in action. And in fact, when we get to Shakespeare, we'll talk about that we can predict when and where these rises and falls will occur. I also wanted to direct your attention to page 1115 of the textbook, where it talks a little bit about writing about drama. And these are some questions that you can ask yourself when you're reading, or perhaps these are questions that you can address when you are writing a journal, or even eventually when you have to write a paper about drama. Well, first, did you enjoy the play? 2, what is the significance of the title? 3. What information do the stage directions provide us? 4. How is the exposition or background information revealed? 5. How is the setting important? You'll see that many of these questions are very similar to the questions we ask ourselves with short story. 6. What foreshadowing is used? Which might mean that we might have to do multiple readings or watchings of a drama. 7. What is the major conflict in the play? 8. Are there subplots in the play? 9. Is a pyramid structure used in the play? 10. Who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist? 11. How does the playwright reveal characters? 12. What's the purpose of the minor characters? 13. Do the characters all use the same kind of language, and if not, why? Is their language formal or informal, and what does that reveal about their personalities? 14. Does your response to the characters change over the course of the play? 15. Are words or images repeated in the play so they have special meaning? 16. How does the playwright's use of language contribute to the tone of the play? 17. Are there any symbols used in the play? 18. Are there any unfamiliar theatrical conventions used in the play? 19. Is the theme directly stated, or is it developed implicitly throughout the play? 20. How does the play reflect the values of the society in which it is set and which it was written? That'll be particularly important for a play like Oedipus, which is so old and from a different world, a different culture. 21. How does this play reflect or challenge your own values? 22. Is there a recording of the play that you can watch to help you visualize? 23. How would you produce this play on stage if you were the director? How would you make these choices about casting actors and developing sets and so forth? 24. Is there a particular critical approach that seems well suited to interpreting this play? 25. How does biographical information about the author help you understand the play? 26. How does historical information about the time help you understand the play? 27. How do your experiences, values, beliefs, and assumptions influence your interpretations of the play? 28. What kinds of evidence from the play are you focusing on to support your interpretation? And 29. Given there are a variety of ways to interpret the play, which one seems most useful to you? Not that these are the only questions to ask yourself, but these are things to keep in the back of your mind when you're reading and watching a performance. But note that each performance will be different based on the actors and based on the director and based on their interpretations. So ultimately, we've got the play itself, that stays the same. And that's what we are going to be interpreting from a literature perspective. But since plays are about performance, I also wanted to address the performance aspect as well. As you know, while we're talking about dramas, and eventually we'll move on from Oedipus the King to Midsummer Night's Dream from Shakespeare, and then finally A Raisin in the Sun, you are in the midst of considering your first paper on short story. As I am working on the journals that you submitted about short story and returning those back to you so that perhaps some of that could help you inform your thinking about paper number 1. So we'll have a little bit more time to work on that first paper. And what I'm going to ask you for today's attendance question is also related to paper number 1, much like I asked in your last attendance question. This is due on Friday, the 8th of October at 10 a.m. in our discussion forum. And again, if you need additional time, please let me know and I'll be happy to grant it to you. But at this point, what do you think will be your biggest challenge in writing paper number 1 and why? What do you think will be your biggest challenge in writing paper number 1 and why? And right now I've got the paper due for the 14th of October. So next class we can talk a little bit more about the paper. And certainly if you need additional time for the paper, you can ask me and I'll be happy to grant it to you. But let's try to keep to that due date if at all possible for the 14th. A 4 to 5 page paper analyzing one element within short story. So I hope you're all doing well. I am doing well. Next class, we'll continue to talk about the paper and continue to transition into Oedipus the King. Take care, and I'll see you next class. Bye-bye.